So from there, it moves on to the section Toitū Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and this is the section that houses the historical account, that houses the Crown acknowledgements, the Crown apology. So the historical account really includes reference to the fact that whānau Apanui, before the signing of Te Tiriti, we were possessed of our own rangatiratanga. We weren't sitting on the beach in Te Kaha waiting for the Crown or anyone else to come and save us from ourselves or to complete us as people. We were already a complete functional nation with our own tribal government and tribal laws in place. So the historical account makes reference to the fact that at the time that the British Crown first came to New Zealand and on the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, that was the state of play. And we're saying we've maintained that rangatiratanga all the way through. We've never relinquished that. The signing of the treaty didn't sign that over to any foreign power. So we acknowledged that we had full systems of self-government and were in complete control of our own affairs at 1840. We acknowledged Te Tiriti o Waitangi sets out a framework for the relationship between our hapū, the hapū of Te Whānau Apanui, in their sovereign capacities, and the British Crown at that point. Although we had little contact with the Crown at the beginning of the treaty relationship, they were busy in Wellington exercising authority that was contrary to the agreements that they had made with our people. And then we talk about Te Tūrekai Whenua, the importation of a new land regime for this country that then took our customary ways of holding land and converted them into land titles and land shares and set up the native land court system and really disrupted and undermined and dismantled our tribal way of holding land and authority and impacted on our collectives and the way that we socially organised. So those things are all captured in the historical account. It makes for some gruesome reading at times. It talks through in the historical account about the Crown's land purchases and some of the dealings that went on that were in the Crown's mind less than ideal, but in our mind quite devious and undermining that relationship that we were supposed to have protected by Article 2 of the treaty. We talk about te patu wairua, te takahi tapu, and how the Crown's acts and omissions impacted on our socio-economic justice and well-being systems that we had set up within the iwi, and resulted really in the situation where Apanui have been disadvantaged both on our own lands and then through the urbanisation part of colonisation that then followed through the disconnection and disenfranchisement of our people. The historical account also acknowledges specific wrongdoing in regards to certain things that the Crown did. For example, the maintenance or substandard provision of infrastructure into the area in ways that put our people at ongoing risk. And we've sort of talked in that historical account about the imbalance of the treaty relationship that Te Whānau Apanui and its hapū have always tried to exercise honourably our treaty relationship and have contributed to this nation and contributed to the wider kind of New Zealand politic, including those of our iwi that were engaged in the war efforts and other contributions into the national infrastructure, and how that imbalance has come to pass where we have been good honourable treaty partners but the Crown in a reciprocal way have not done that. From there, Toitū Te Tiriti o Waitangi section moves into the Crown acknowledgements. Like I said before, this is where the Crown go through all of the alleged breaches that we've put in front of them and pick out those of the alleged breaches that they will cough to, that they'll acknowledge. It hasn't been the whole suite of allegations against them that they've been prepared to admit. Some of that is not because there's not evidence for it. Some of that's because it reflects the politics of the day. And there's certain things that the Crown, in their capacity as coloniser, are not able to admit because it attacks sort of the heart of their colonial fictions. So they sit out there. We've still put them there as our allegations against the Crown, and we've owned those statements. But where the Crown have been able to meet us, they've made specific acknowledgements. I'm going to read through those acknowledgements so that you can get the flavour of them, but it's also very important, again, part of our ongoing iwi story, to ensure that where the Crown acknowledges their wrongdoing and their impact on our people over multiple generations, that's not just signed away and put on a shelf somewhere and collect dust and nobody see it again. This is probably the crux of the deed of settlement. The redress package and the compensation and the structural setup that follows is actually by the by. This is the acknowledgement where the Crown says they finally, for once, in black and white and in writing, instead of the colonial gaslighting we've had for 184 years, they finally say, we admit we've done things wrong in regards to the rangatiratanga of this iwi, and it's impacted on them, it's impacted on their territory, and it's impacted on their mokopuna. And that's why the acknowledgements are probably the most weighty part of the Deed of Settlement. So I'm going to read through each of them. It'll get a bit heavy, but hang in there because this is the weighty bit. So the Crown makes a series of acknowledgements, including that Te Whānau Apanui has upheld its obligations as a treaty partner and tried over many years to have the Crown uphold their obligations under the treaty. So it talks of our efforts to continue to hold the Crown to account, because this is not the first time we've been to the table with the Crown to remind them of their treaty obligations. So this acknowledges the long journey, not just of the current negotiation team, which has actually been a flash of history, a small blink of an eye compared to the 184 odd years our tipuna have tried to hold this government to account also. The acknowledgements make reference to the fact that Apanui has upheld its treaty obligations. We have been honourable treaty partners. The acknowledgements talk of the tino rangatiratanga of the Hapū of Te Whānau Apanui, and that acts and omissions of the Crown have undermined the tino rangatiratanga of the Hapū of Te Whānau Apanui. This is the first time this is going to appear in print in the history of our nation, that the Crown actually admit that they have undermined their laws, their policies, their actions and omissions have undermined and have sought in some places to undermine our rangatiratanga. There's acknowledgement that the Crown's assimilationist policies negatively impacted on the Hapū of Te Whānau Apanui. As we know, that effort to have us all as one New Zealand, which really meant put down your Apanuitanga, put down your rangatiratanga and come under Crown authority. They've admitted that the assimilation policies have negatively impacted on our Hapū. The Crown acknowledged their acts and omissions undermined the tikanga of the Hapū of Te Whānau Apanui in relation to our lands and our territories, and that has caused or contributed to the alienation of some of those lands and territories, and has contributed to our alienation from those lands and territories, so it's interrupted that relationship. The Crown acknowledge and admit that they did not consult with Te Whānau Apanui before introducing native land laws in the 1860s, and that the operation and impact of those laws contributed to the erosion of our Hapū tribal structures. This is a key acknowledgement, because on the back, sometimes the Crown and the history books have colonisation reduced to a series of transactions that where they look to correct certain transactions that went wrong over certain bits of land, then they say they've pieced back together an honourable relationship. That is not the case. That's not factually correct. What we have tried to get the Crown to acknowledge, and in that Crown acknowledgement, they've got some of the way there, is to say not only did your land laws come in and fragment up the land and trigger a series of transactions that then impacted on us, the part of the impact of that, knowingly or not, but we've obviously said to the Crown, you knew what you were doing because it was designed this way, contributed to the erosion of Te Whānau Apanui Hapū tribal structures. So they look to destabilise our self-government by the introduction of foreign land laws that then fragmented up our collectives and the way we socially organised ourselves. Once you start undermining that, for a people that organise themselves collectively, you then are able to ride all of the colonial violence that comes by way of law and policy on the back of that, because you've weakened the tribal structures and the tribal governmental structures that supported us. So that acknowledgement is really important inside the Deed of Settlement. There's an acknowledgement from the Crown that they were aware that the crossing of the Motu was dangerous, and they had been, in fact, petitioned by Apanui to have a school in Maraenui for a period of time. The acknowledgement note that they were aware that the crossing of the Motu was potentially dangerous and of the tragic loss of life that occurred, and that it discriminated against Te Whānau Apanui when it declined to fund a bridge over the Motu River to make it safe. The reason that they declined that infrastructure investment was because Te Whānau Apanui would not open our lands up to European settlement. It was a punishment from the Crown upon us as an iwi because we wouldn't allow foreigners to come into our lands. We wouldn't surrender our lands up for European settlement. So they then continued a situation where our children were at risk because they declined the funding for a safe bridge over the Motu, specifically for that reason. So that acknowledgement, again, this is the first time in history that the Crown have actually acknowledged that kino intention of theirs. Not just that they didn't have the money, not just that they couldn't invest in that area because they had other priorities, but that there was a punitive or punishment element to the reason that they didn't invest in that safe infrastructure. The Crown acknowledged also the degradation of the Raukumara ranges and the sedimentation that has impacted on our awa, basically the desecration of our taiao, and what we are now fighting back with today with the Raukumara Restoration Project. The Crown acknowledged inside the Deed of Settlement their contribution to that, which has been huge in terms of the introduction of pest species and the mismanagement of that area. The acknowledgements, Crown acknowledgements, also acknowledge the impact of native schools to promote the assimilation of Te Whānau Apanui citizens. So to promote the assimilation of our mokopuna over to a colonial way of thinking, the impact of the native schools regime. So schools were required, as we know, to speak and teach in English at the time, and Whānau Apanui children, like many Māori mokopuna around the country, were punished for speaking their own language. There's an acknowledgement in there that the Crown failed to actively protect te reo rangatira and encourage its use. We know, of course, the impact of that on an Indigenous nation. When you take from them their ability to speak in their own language, means that they cannot access all of the mātauranga that comes in on the back of that language. So it's really the assimilationist policies that came through that native school regime have been a key tool in colonising our people, because they're about the colonisation of the mind and the replacement of our tribal Indigenous truths for a colonial narrative. So there's an acknowledgement in there around the impact of native schools. There's a specific Crown acknowledgement in regards to Apanui suffering socio and economic deprivation for far too long in a way that has impacted on our people. So Whānau Apanui have suffered socio-economic deprivation for far too long, and Apanui were not consulted about Crown policies that might have detrimental impact to their health, education, economic development and cultural practices. This is not unknown to us. Largely the government in Wellington have carried on unilaterally making decisions for long periods of time and have sought not the consent of our people. Sometimes they've gone round in these policy roadshows, as we know, and reduced our right to give consent or have full, exclusive and undisturbed possession of our territories. They've reduced that to the right to be consulted sometimes. So we've got a Crown acknowledgement in there that there's been an impact in terms of socio-economic deprivation, but also the unilateral nature in which the Crown have continued to make decisions that impact on us without our consent. There's an acknowledgement that the Crown encouraged Te Whānau Apanui to leave our rohe, to alienate themselves from their own tribal lands. So leave the rohe, and this has impeded intergenerational transmission of mātauranga and eroded the cohesion of our iwi, and resulted in disconnection of whole generations of our mokopuna to our tribal base and what used to be a source of strength for us in terms of our rangatiratanga, but now not connected because of the Crown's interference in our tribal self-government. There's an acknowledgement by the Crown that Whānau Apanui made significant contributions to the development of New Zealand, and despite Crown acts and omissions, Apanui have remained resilient and retained our tino rangatiratanga, tribal identity, mana motuhake to the present day. So there's a meaty chunk of those acknowledgements fleshed out in full in the Deed of Settlement, and that follows on into the apology, where the Crown then turn around and say, having admitted that we did all of those things, here's an apology from us for doing those things to your iwi. The I'm going to read the Crown Apology out word for word the way it's set out in the deed so that you can hear it. The Crown apologises to the tūpuna, the rangatira, the kaumātua, the tamariki and mokopuna of Te Whānau Apanui. The Crown states, before you signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Whānau Apanui exercised tino rangatiratanga over your affairs. The Crown guaranteed in Te Tiriti o Waitangi that Te Whānau Apanui would retain tino rangatiratanga. Instead, the Crown has promoted laws and policies that have undermined Te Whānau Apanui, tino rangatiratanga, and this has wrought immense harm on your iwi. For this, the Crown sincerely apologises. The Crown deeply regrets that its policies to colonise and assimilate Māori into European culture have caused prejudice to generations of Te Whānau Apanui. Crown policies have contributed to the socio-economic marginalisation of too many Te Whānau Apanui and the disconnection of Te Whānau Apanui from mātauranga Māori and your taonga te reo Māori. For this, the Crown profoundly apologises. The Crown apologises for its breaches of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, which has tarnished its honour and brought great harm to Te Whānau Apanui. The Crown is deeply sorry for its failures to protect the tamariki of Te Whānau Apanui, the times it has discriminated against Te Whānau Apanui, and the disconnection Te Whānau Apanui have suffered from some important parts of your whenua. The Crown pays tribute to Te Whānau Apanui resilience during your long struggle for justice and recognises the contribution of Te Whānau Apanui have made to the development of New Zealand and the nation's defence. The Crown also recognises the prominence of the descendants of Apanui Ringamutu today in many spheres of New Zealand life, including politics, law, sport, and visual and performing arts. The Crown sees the settlement we signed today as heralding a new beginning for the partnership between Te Whānau Apanui and the Crown based on good faith, mutual respect, and Te Tiriti o Waitangi and its principles. So the commitment then follows on from the Crown to say that the Crown and Te Whānau Apanui agree that Te Tiriti o Waitangi lays an important foundation for the conduct of present and ongoing relationship between us, and acknowledges that we look forward to building an enduring relationship of mutual trust, cooperation based on Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So that's still to come, still to eventuate, but the acknowledgement about the commitment to realign what has been an abusive and dysfunctional relationship into something healthier and more what was envisaged by the original treaty promise. That commitment going forward is captured inside the Deed of Settlement as well.